the shadowed halls of Ashfield Manor, a mysterious guest vanishes into the night, leaving behind a locked room and a trail of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of hidden passages, whispered fears, and dangerous motives. A torn receipt, a gold-tipped cigarette, a cryptic ledger, each clue pulls her closer to the truth. As dusk falls, deception unravels, revealing blackmail, betrayal, and a desperate act. Will Miss Marple expose the culprit before the shadows claim another secret? Dive into The Vanishing Guest at dusk, where nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Ashfield Manor. The late October sun hung low over Chipping Norton, bathing the village in a golden haze that softened the edges of its stone cottages and winding lanes. In her modest home on the High Street, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her drawing room, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of long habit. The click of the needles was the only sound, save for the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the garden path outside. On the rosewood table beside her, a cup of tea had grown cold, forgotten in the wake of a letter that now held her attention. The letter, penned in the bold, looping hand of Mrs. Eleanor Bantry, had arrived with the morning post. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read it again, her pale blue eyes sharp with interest. "My dear Jane," it began, "Arthur and I have settled at Ashfield Manor, and we are hosting a small gathering this weekend. A few friends, some new faces, and a chance to breathe life into this old house. I confess, there's an odd feeling here. Nothing I can put my finger on, but I'd value your presence. Your knack for seeing things clearly is just what we need. Do come." Miss Marple set the letter down, her lips pursing thoughtfully. Eleanor Bantry was not given to flights of fancy. Her words, though light, carried a weight that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Ashfield Manor, she recalled, was a Georgian pile on the outskirts of the village, its grandeur faded by years of neglect. Eleanor and her husband, Colonel Arthur Bantry, had purchased it only months ago, seeking a quieter life after years in London. An odd feeling in such a place was not surprising, yet Eleanor's request suggested more than mere unease. With a decisiveness that belied her frail appearance, Miss Marple folded her knitting, a half-finished shawl in soft grey wool, and began preparations. She packed a small suitcase with practical items, a warm cardigan, her best lace cap, and, of course, her knitting bag. By noon she was aboard the local omnibus, its rattling progress carrying her toward Ashfield Manor. The manor loomed into view as the sun dipped toward the horizon, its red brick facade aglow with the last light of day. Ivy clung to its walls, curling around tall windows that seemed to watch the approach of visitors. Eleanor Bantry stood at the entrance, her auburn hair slightly dishevelled, her smile warm but tinged with strain. "Jane, you're a godsend," she exclaimed, embracing her friend. "This house is grand, but it's got a mind of its own." They settled in the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound books and heavy oak furniture. Over tea, Eleanor elaborated. "It's nothing definite," she said, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. A vase moved from one table to another. A door left ajar when I'm sure I closed it. Arthur says it's the servants, but I'm not so certain. And our guests, well, they're a mixed lot." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Tell me about them," she said, her voice gentle but probing. Eleanor leaned forward. "There's Lawrence Redding, an artist, charming, but he keeps to himself. Clara Vane, the actress, all sparkle and sharp edges. Dr. Simon Haydock, a physician from London, terribly reserved. And Mrs. Lydia Price, a widow with more money than tact. Oh, and a late addition, Mr. Victor Crane, some sort of businessman. He wired yesterday to confirm." Miss Marple nodded, committing the names to memory. She had a way of cataloguing people, much like she catalogued the habits of her neighbours in Chipping Norton. A charming artist, a sharp-tongued actress, a reserved doctor, a gossipy widow, and a last-minute businessman. The cast promised intrigue. Dinner was served in the dining room, its long mahogany table gleaming under a chandelier that flickered with age. The guests assembled, each bringing their own air to the room. Lawrence Redding, with his dark curls and easy smile, recounted a tale of painting in Florence, though his eyes flicked often to the door. Clara Vane, resplendent in a scarlet dress, dominated the conversation with stories of her West End triumphs, her laughter a touch too loud. Dr. Haydock, thin and bespectacled, spoke little, his fork moving methodically. Lydia Price, her pearls glinting, dropped pointed remarks about London society, her gaze lingering on each guest as if weighing their worth. Victor Crane, however, drew Miss Marple's keenest attention. He arrived as the soup was served, his suit immaculate, but his manner distracted. A man in his 40s, with a sharp jaw and restless hands, he offered vague pleasantries about business in the city. His suitcase, carried in by the butler, was small and light, as if packed in haste. Throughout the meal, he ate sparingly, his eyes darting to the tall windows where dusk deepened into night. When Clara teased him about his quietness, he forced a smile and murmured something about a long journey. As the clock in the hall chimed 9, Crane rose abruptly. "Forgive me," he said, his voice tight. "I'm rather tired. I'll retire for the night." He bowed stiffly and left, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Miss Marple watched him go, her fingers still on her napkin. There was something in his pallor, in the way his hand had gripped his glass, that spoke of more than fatigue. She glanced at Eleanor, who was frowning slightly, then at the other guests who resumed their chatter with barely a pause. The room felt colder, though the fire burned brightly. Later, as she prepared for bed in her guest room, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing at the darkened garden below. The manor was silent, save for the creak of old wood settling. She thought of Eleanor's letter, of Crane's unease, and of the fleeting shadows beyond the glass. "Something unsettled," she murmured, her breath misting the pain. In her experience, unsettled places and people rarely stayed so for long. Chapter 2. The Empty Room. The morning after the dinner at Ashfield Manor dawned grey and heavy, with a mist clinging to the Cotswolds hills like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple awoke early, her internal clock as precise as ever, and dressed in her sensible tweed skirt and cardigan. The air in her guest room was chilly, the radiator giving only a half-hearted gurgle. She glanced out the window, where the garden lay shrouded, its shapes indistinct, and felt a prickle of anticipation. Something about the previous evening, Mr. Victor Crane's abrupt departure from the dining room, his pallid face, had lodged in her mind like a stray thread in a neat stitch. Downstairs, the breakfast room was abuzz with the clink of china and the murmur of voices. Eleanor Bantry, ever the gracious hostess, was pouring coffee. Her smile strained as she navigated the guests' varied moods. Colonel Arthur Bantry, sat at the head of the table, his newspaper raised like a barricade, muttering about unreliable tradesmen. Lawrence Redding, the artist, was sketching idly on a napkin, his charm subdued by the early hour. Clara Vane, her scarlet lipstick a stark contrast to the morning's pallor, was recounting a theatrical mishap to anyone who would listen. Dr. Simon Haydock ate in silence, his spectacles glinting as he avoided eye contact. Lydia Price, her pearls catching the dim light, was already whispering about the stock market to no one in particular. It was Eleanor who broke the morning's rhythm. "Has anyone seen Mr. Crane?" she asked, her voice light but edged with unease. "He didn't come down for breakfast." The table fell silent. Lawrence looked up from his sketch, his pencil pausing. "Not since last night," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Clara shrugged, her bangles jangling. "Probably sleeping off a late night," she said, though her glance toward the door suggested doubt. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat but said nothing, his fingers tightening on his fork. Lydia Price raised an eyebrow. Odd man, that one. Kept looking at the windows as if expecting a ghost. Miss Marple, buttering a slice of toast, listened without comment. She had noted Crane's unease the previous evening, the way his hand had trembled as he lifted his glass. His excuse of fatigue had rung hollow, like a line poorly delivered. She caught Eleanor's eye and gave a small nod as if to say, "Let us see." Eleanor led the way to Crane's room on the second floor, Miss Marple following with her measured step. The corridor was lined with faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow the women as they passed. The door to Crane's room was ajar, a fact that made Eleanor pause. "I'm sure the maid closed it," she murmured, pushing it open. The room was pristine, almost unnaturally so. The bed was made, its counterpane smooth, the pillows uncreased. Crane's suitcase sat on a stand, unopened, its leather surface free of dust. The wardrobe was empty, save for a single coat hung neatly. The window, a tall sash affair, was locked from the inside, its latch stiff with age. A faint smell of tobacco lingered, though no ashtray was in sight. Eleanor's face paled. "He hasn't slept here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where could he have gone?" Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a watchmaker. She noted the polished floorboards, where a faint scuff mark marred the shine near the fireplace. Bending slightly, she peered into the grate, where a single cigarette butt lay among the ashes. Its paper was gold-tipped, an unusual brand she didn't recognize. "Curious," she said softly, straightening. "A man who vanishes without touching his bed is either in a great hurry or not gone by his own choice." Eleanor wrung her hands. "Arthur will say he's run off, some business deal gone sour, but this feels wrong." Miss Marple patted her friend's arm. "Let us not jump to conclusions, my dear. People are like books. Sometimes you must read between the lines to understand their story." They returned downstairs, where Colonel Bantry was summoned. He stomped into the hall, his moustache bristling. "What's all this fuss?" he demanded. Upon hearing of Crane's absence, he snorted. "Fellow probably had debts chasing him. Bolted in the night, mark my words." But his bluster faltered when Miss Marple mentioned the locked window and untouched bed. "Well, that's dashed odd," he admitted, scratching his head. The other guests were gathered in the drawing-room, their curiosity tinged with unease. Miss Marple observed them closely as Eleanor explained the situation. Lawrence Redding leaned against the mantelpiece, his expression unreadable. "I saw him last night," he offered, "near the garden just before dinner. He was pacing, looked agitated, didn't speak to me." Clara Vane, perched on a velvet settee, tilted her head. "I heard footsteps in the corridor after midnight," she said, her voice dramatic. Light, quick steps, like someone trying not to be heard. "But I'd had a glass of sherry, so I thought nothing of it." She smiled, but her eyes darted to Lawrence, who avoided her gaze. Dr. Haydock adjusted his spectacles. "If he left, he might have had an emergency," he said, his tone measured. "Businessmen often do." But his hands folded tightly in his lap betrayed a tension Miss Marple noted. Lydia Price, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief, leaned forward. "That man had secrets," she declared. "I heard him on the telephone yesterday afternoon, in the study. He was whispering about delivering the goods and no more delays. Sounded like trouble to me." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Lydia's gossip, though often embellished, was a thread worth following. "Did you hear anything else, Mrs. Price?" she asked gently. Lydia hesitated, relishing the attention. "Only that he mentioned a name. Haydock, I think, yes, I'm sure of it." She glanced at the doctor, who stiffened but said nothing. The village constable, a young man named Polk, arrived shortly after, his notebook in hand. He was earnest but out of his depth, his round face creased with worry as he surveyed Crane's room. "No signs of a struggle," he said, peering at the locked window. "And no one saw him leave the grounds. It's like he vanished into thin air, Miss Marple." She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Air, Constable, is rarely as empty as it seems. Things leave traces, scuff marks, cigarette butts, words overheard. We must simply look for them." Polk nodded, though his expression suggested he found her cryptic. He questioned the staff, a butler, 2 maids, and a cook, who reported nothing unusual beyond a broken latch on a side gate, which they assumed was due to the wind. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the garden Lawrence had mentioned. As the morning wore on, the household settled into an uneasy rhythm. Eleanor fretted, Arthur grumbled, and the guests exchanged wary glances. Miss Marple, however, felt a familiar spark of purpose. She thought of her village, Chipping Norton, where small oddities, a misplaced letter, a stranger's glance, often hid larger truths. Crane's disappearance was no accident, she was certain. The scuff mark, the cigarette, the whispered telephone call, they were clues, like stitches in a pattern she had yet to unravel. She excused herself to the library, ostensibly to read, but her eyes strayed to the window, where the mist was beginning to lift. Beyond the glass, the garden stretched toward the horizon, its paths twisting into shadow. Somewhere out there, she thought, was the key to Victor Crane's vanishing, and she intended to find it. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Garden. The mist that had cloaked Chipping Norton that morning had burned away by noon, leaving the grounds of Ashfield Manor bathed in the pale, slanting light of an autumn afternoon. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders, stepped out onto the gravel path that wound through the manor's gardens. Her stout shoes crunched softly, the sound a counterpoint to the distant caw of a rook. The air carried the sharp scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and she paused to survey the scene, her eyes as keen as a sparrow's. The garden, though grand in design, was unkempt, rose bushes tangled, hedges untrimmed, and a stone fountain at its centre choked with moss. It was, she thought, a place where secrets might easily take root. Her purpose was not idle wandering. The clues from Victor Crane's empty room, the scuff mark, the gold-tipped cigarette butt, had set her mind in motion. And Lawrence Redding's mention of seeing Crane in the garden at dusk nagged at her. She had learned, in her quiet observations of village life, that people often betrayed themselves in the places they felt unwatched. The garden, she suspected, held more than thorns and shadows. She began at the fountain, its basin cracked and dry save for a thin film of rainwater. Kneeling with a care for her joints, she examined the ground nearby. The earth was soft, disturbed by recent footsteps, though the morning's mist had blurred their edges. Among the rose bushes flanking the path, she spotted something caught in the thorns, a scrap of paper, yellowed and torn. With a delicate touch, she freed it, revealing a receipt for a London tailor, dated 3 days prior. The name V. Crane was scrawled in ink across the top, the handwriting hurried. She tucked it into her pocket, her lips pursing. A man who vanished without unpacking his suitcase, yet left a receipt in the garden, was a puzzle indeed. Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Eleanor Bantry in the morning room, her brow furrowed as she sorted through a tray of silver. "Jane, it's the oddest thing," Eleanor said, holding up a candlestick. "This was on the mantel yesterday, I'm certain. Now it's in the dining room. The maids swear they didn't move it." Her voice held a note of exasperation, but her eyes searched Miss Marple's face for reassurance. "Small things often move in large houses," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, "but they rarely move themselves." She did not mention the receipt, nor the cigarette butt, but her mind wove them together with the misplaced candlestick. Disordered objects, she knew, were often the footprints of disordered minds. She sought out Clara Vane next, finding her in the conservatory, a glass of lemonade in hand. The actress was radiant in a green silk dress, but her eyes were restless, flitting to the garden beyond the glass walls. Miss Marple settled beside her, her knitting bag in her lap, and remarked on the beauty of the roses. Clara, eager for distraction, launched into a tale of a disastrous stage performance, but Miss Marple gently steered the conversation. "You mentioned hearing footsteps last night," she said, her needles clicking, "in the corridor after midnight. Could you tell me more?" Clara's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on her glass. "Oh, it was nothing really, just a creak or two. This old house is full of noises." She hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping. "But I did see something odd before dinner. Crane was in the hall, arguing with Lawrence Redding. Heated it was, something about money owed. Lawrence looked furious, but Crane just laughed. That nervous sort of laugh, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Money," she said, "has a way of sharpening tempers. Did you hear anything specific?" Clara shook her head. "Only snatches. Lawrence said something about not being played for a fool. I didn't linger, didn't want to seem nosy." But her eyes gleamed with the thrill of gossip, and Miss Marple knew she had lingered longer than she admitted. Thanking Clara, Miss Marple made her way to the library, where she found Dr. Simon Haydock reading a medical journal. His thin frame was hunched, his spectacles low on his nose. She greeted him warmly, commenting on the manor's fine collection of books. He responded politely, but with a reserve that bordered on wariness. Undeterred, She mentioned Crane's disappearance, watching his reaction. "A strange business," Haydock said, closing his journal. "He might have left for urgent reasons. Men like Crane, businessmen, often have pressing matters." His voice was steady, but his fingers tapped the table, a faint rhythm of unease. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Though it's curious he left no note, no sign. You knew him, I believe." "Mrs. Price mentioned hearing his voice on the telephone, speaking your name." Haydock's hand stilled. "Did she?" he said, his voice tight. After a pause, he added, "I treated him once, in London. A minor ailment, nervous exhaustion. He was under strain, mentioned business troubles, nothing more." But his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up his neck. She thanked him and withdrew, her mind turning over his words. Nervous exhaustion, business troubles, an argument about money, the threads were multiplying, but they had yet to form a pattern. She thought of her neighbour in Chipping Norton, young Mr. Ellis, who had once vanished for a day after a quarrel with his partner, only to return shamefaced with a tale of debts. People, she mused, were predictable in their unpredictability. As evening approached, she joined Eleanor for tea in the drawing-room. The fire cast a warm glow, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken questions. Colonel Bantry had taken to pacing, muttering about calling in a detective from Oxford. "This Crane business is nonsense," he grumbled. "Man's probably halfway to London by now." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the flickering flames. "Perhaps," she said, "but a man who leaves his suitcase behind is rarely in a hurry to go far." She thought of the receipt, caught in the thorns, and the cigarette butt. Its gold tip an anomaly in a house where no one admitted to smoking such a brand. The girl garden, she decided, warranted another visit. As dusk fell, she slipped out again, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill. The fountain loomed in the twilight, its stone face solemn. She circled it, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the base, half buried in the soil, she found a small metal button, its surface etched with a crest she didn't recognize. It was polished, recently dropped, and unlike anything she'd seen on the guest's clothing. She pocketed it, her heart quickening. The garden, it seemed, was not done yielding its secrets. Back in her room, she sat by the lamp, her knitting untouched. The receipt, the cigarette, the button, they were fragments, like the pieces of a quilt she had once helped her niece assemble. Alone, they meant little. Together they might tell a story. And Victor Crane, she was certain, was at the heart of it. As the manor settled into silence, Miss Marple's mind was anything but still, weaving through the shadows of Ashfield's secrets. Chapter 4. The Artist's Secret. The morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows of Ashfield Manor, casting long shadows across the oak-panelled hall. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, descended the staircase with her usual measured step. Her mind, as alert as her appearance, was unassuming. The house was quiet, save for the distant clatter of breakfast dishes and the low murmur of voices from the dining room. The mystery of Victor Crane's disappearance hung over the manor like the autumn mist, and Miss Marple felt the threads of the puzzle tightening in her grasp. The receipt from the garden, the gold-tipped cigarette, the misplaced candlestick, and now the curious button with its unfamiliar crest. These were not random, she was certain, but part of a pattern only half revealed. She had decided to seek out Lawrence Redding, the artist, whose mention of seeing Crane in the garden and Clara Vane's report of his heated exchange with the missing man had piqued her interest. There was something in Lawrence's easy charm, his quick smile, that reminded her of a young man in Chipping Norton who had once charmed half the village while quietly forging cheques. Charm, she knew, could be a mask as much as a mirror. She found him in the orchard beyond the garden, his easel set up beneath a gnarled apple tree. The canvas before him depicted Ashfield Manor at dusk, its windows aglow with an almost spectral light, the shadows of the ivy twisting like fingers. He was dabbing at the painting with a fine brush, his dark curls falling over his brow. But his movements lacked the focus of true absorption. Miss Marple approached, her shoes soft on the grass. "Good morning, Mr. Redding," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "Your painting captures the manor beautifully. You have a keen eye for its character." Lawrence started slightly, then flashed his winning smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's the light here. Tricky, but it gives the place a certain mood." He gestured to the canvas, but his eyes flicked to her, wary beneath the charm. She nodded, settling onto a nearby bench, as if merely to enjoy the air. "A house like this must inspire all sorts of ideas," she said. "I understand you saw Mr. Crane in the garden before he vanished. It must have been striking seeing him so agitated." Lawrence's brush paused, a drop of ochre paint clinging to its tip. "Did I say agitated? Perhaps I exaggerated. He was pacing, that's all. Looked like a man with too much on his mind." He resumed painting, but the strokes were less precise. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she drew out her knitting, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "Miss Vane mentioned an argument between you and Mr. Crane," she said, her tone conversational. "Something about money, I believe. Arguments can be so unsettling, can't they?" Lawrence's smile faltered, and he set his brush down, wiping his hands on a rag. The rag, Miss Marple noted, was stained with a deep blue pigment, yet his canvas showed no such colour. "Clara's got a flair for drama," he said, his voice light but strained. "It wasn't an argument, just a discussion. Crane approached me about some business venture, selling paintings, quick profits, that sort of thing. I told him I wasn't interested. I paint for art, not for schemes." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "A wise choice, I'm sure. Though it's curious, isn't it, how money can stir such passions? I once knew a man in Chipping Norton who argued over a debt and vanished for a week. Turned out he'd been hiding in his own attic." She smiled, as if sharing a harmless anecdote, but Lawrence's jaw tightened. "He was pushy," Lawrence admitted, his voice lower now. "Kept talking about connections in London, big buyers. I didn't trust him. Said I wouldn't be played for a fool." He caught himself, as if realizing he'd said too much, and forced a laugh. "Anyway, he's gone now. Probably off chasing his next deal." Miss Marple nodded, her needles never pausing, the blue paint on the rag, the argument, Lawrence's quick deflection. They were threads, and she tucked them away. "Thank you, Mr. Redding," she said, rising. "I'll leave you to your work. The manor does look splendid on your canvas." As she walked back toward the house, her mind turned over the encounter. Lawrence's charm was polished, but there were cracks. His unease, the paint that didn't match, the defensive edge to his story. She thought of the button she'd found by the fountain, its crest unfamiliar. Could it belong to Lawrence, or was it another piece of the puzzle? Inside, she found Eleanor Bantry in the drawing room, sorting through a pile of linens with a distracted air. "Jane, this house is driving me to distraction," Eleanor said, her voice tight. First the candlestick, now a silver tray, moved from the sideboard to the pantry. The servants insist they didn't touch it. Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. "Houses like this have many hands, Eleanor. Some more careful than others." She didn't mention the button or the paint, but her mind was weaving them into the pattern. Objects moved. A man vanished. There was intent here, she was sure. Later she sought out Dr. Haydock, finding him in the library, his nose buried in a medical text. She greeted him warmly, commenting on the manor's fine collection of botanical prints. He responded with his usual reserve, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he turned a page. Miss Marple, ever gentle, mentioned Crane's disappearance, watching his reaction. "A troubling affair," Haydock said, his voice clipped. "I scarcely knew the man, though I treated him briefly in London. Nervous exhaustion. Nothing unusual for a man in his line of work." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. "Mrs. Price mentioned hearing your name in a telephone conversation of his," she said, her tone light. "It must be trying, being drawn into such mysteries." Haydock's fingers froze on the page. "Lydia Price hears what she wants to hear," he said, a touch sharply. "Crane mentioned me, yes, but only in passing. He was worried about enemies, business rivals, I suppose. I advised rest, nothing more." But his eyes slid away, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. She thanked him and withdrew, her mind buzzing. Enemies, nervous exhaustion, a moved tray, a blue-stained rag. The pieces were accumulating, but the shape of the puzzle remained elusive. She thought of a girl in Chipping Norton who had once hidden a stolen brooch in a neighbour's garden, thinking it clever. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, were rarely as clever as their keepers believed. As the afternoon waned, she sat by her window, gazing at the orchard where Lawrence's easel stood empty. The manor's shadows lengthened, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes. The button in her pocket, the receipt, the cigarette. They were clues, yes, but also warnings. Someone in this house knew more than they admitted, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. Chapter 5. The Whispered Clue. The afternoon at Ashfield Manor carried a restless air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, moved through the corridors with the quiet purpose of a cat stalking a shadow. The clues she had gathered, the torn receipt, the gold-tipped cigarette, the etched button, the misplaced silver, were like scattered beads, each glinting with possibility but not yet strung into a coherent design. Victor Crane's disappearance, she felt, was no mere whim. It was the centerpiece of a pattern woven by someone in this house. Her task was to find the thread that would unravel it. The morning's conversations had left her with much to ponder. Lawrence Redding's uneasy charm and the blue paint on his rag. Dr. Haydock's guarded admission of treating Crane, Clara Vane's overheard footsteps, and Lydia Price's gossip about a telephone call. They all pointed to secrets, but whose? Miss Marple decided to explore the manor further, trusting that old houses, like old villages, held their truths in forgotten corners. She began in the upper floors, where the corridors were dim and the air heavy with the scent of aged wood. The servants' stairs creaked under her careful steps, and she noted the worn patches on the runner, signs of frequent passage. In the attic, reached by a narrow ladder, she found a jumble of crates and trunks, their surfaces thick with dust. Her eyes, sharp despite the gloom, caught sight of a small ledger tucked beneath a broken chair. Its leather cover was cracked, but the pages were recent, filled with neat columns of figures. Scanning them, she found entries marked VC, payments, substantial ones from an unnamed source, dated over the past month. The final entry was 2 days before Crane's arrival at Ashfield Manor. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Money," she murmured, "is a map that leads to many destinations." She slipped the ledger into her bag, resolving to study it later. The attic, she noted, had a small window overlooking the garden, its view clear to the fountain where she'd found the receipt and button. Someone standing here could have watched the grounds unseen. The thought lingered as she descended. Back in the main house, she paused by a window overlooking the orchard, where Lawrence Redding's easel still stood, its canvas covered against the evening dew. The garden beyond was quiet, but she sensed it held more than it had yet revealed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. Voices, low and urgent, coming from the library. Moving silently, she approached the door, which stood slightly ajar. It was Clara Vane and Lydia Price, their heads bent close. Clara's voice, usually theatrical, was a hushed hiss. "If they find out, Lydia, it'll ruin everything. You know what's at stake." Lydia's reply was sharp, her words clipped. "Keep your nerve, Clara. No one's looking too closely, not yet." The rustle of skirts followed, and Miss Marple stepped back into the shadow of a bookcase, her heart quickening. The women emerged, Clara's face pale beneath her rouge, Lydia's mouth set in a grim line. They parted without noticing Miss Marple, who remained still, her mind racing. Ruin, she thought, was a word that carried weight. She recalled a scandal in Chipping Norton, where a shopkeeper's wife had whispered of ruin over a hidden affair, only for it to be about forged receipts. Words like clues could mislead if taken at face value. But Clara's fear and Lydia's caution suggested a shared secret, one that might connect to Crane's vanishing. She returned to the drawing room, where Eleanor Bantry was arranging flowers, her hands unsteady. "Jane, this house feels like it's closing in," Eleanor said, her voice low. "First Crane, now the servants are whispering about noises in the night. I'm half ready to believe in ghosts." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ghosts, my dear, are often just people who haven't been seen clearly." She mentioned the ledger, keeping her tone light. "I found an old book in the attic, accounts perhaps from a previous owner. It might shed light on the manor's history." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You think it's connected to Crane? Oh, Jane, you're a marvel. But be careful. This place has too many shadows." As evening fell, Miss Marple joined Constable Polk for a quiet word in the hall. He was earnest, his notebook filled with scribbled observations, but his youth showed in his furrowed brow. "I spoke to the gardener, Tom," he said. "He saw a figure in a dark coat by the fountain the night Crane vanished. Thought it was Mr. Redding, but it was too dark to be sure. And the side gate's latch, it's not just broken, it's been forced." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the button with its crest, the scuff mark in Crane's room. "A forced gate suggests haste," she said, "or perhaps intent. Thank you, Constable. Keep your eyes open. Small things often lead to large truths." Alone in her room that night, she spread her clues on the table. The receipt, the cigarette butt, the button, And now the ledger. The payments to VC were substantial, irregular, and recent, too recent to be coincidence. She thought of Clara's whispered fear, Lydia's sharp warning, Lawrence's blue-stained rag, Haydock's guarded demeanour. Each guest, she realised, was like a character in one of Clara's plays, performing a role but hiding their true script. She recalled a case in Chipping Norton, where a missing grocer had been found hiding in a neighbour's shed, driven by fear of a creditor. Crane, she suspected, was no grocer, but fear could drive any man to vanish. The question was, whose fear, his or someone else's? As the manor settled into silence, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched. The garden below was a sea of shadows, the fountain a pale silhouette. The whispered clue from Clara and Lydia echoed in her mind, a thread that might yet tie the others together. She felt the puzzle shifting, its pieces edging closer to a shape she could almost see. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would tug at another thread. Perhaps the garden or the manor's hidden corners would yield the next. Chapter 6. The Hidden Door. The morning sun struggled through a veil of clouds, casting a muted glow over Ashfield Manor. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her small writing desk, gazed at the array of clues before her. The torn tailor's receipt, the gold-tipped cigarette butt, the etched button, and the attic ledger with its cryptic payments to VC. Each item was a whisper of intent, a fragment of a story she was piecing together with the patience of a lacemaker. Victor Crane's disappearance, she was certain, was no impulsive flight. It was a carefully staged act, and the manor itself seemed complicit, its creaking corridors and shadowed corners hiding truths she meant to uncover. After breakfast, where the guests' forced cheer only deepened the house's unease, Miss Marple resolved to explore the manor's less trodden paths. The whispered exchange between Clara Vane and Lydia Price, overheard the previous evening, lingered in her mind. If they find out, it'll ruin everything. Ruin, she knew, was a motive that could twist even the most polished facade. But whose ruin, and how did it connect to Crane? She began in the library, a room of heavy oak shelves and faded velvet curtains, where the air held the musty scent of old paper. Her fingers trailed along the spines of leather-bound volumes, but her eyes were on the room's edges. Mouldings, panels, places where a house might keep its secrets. Near a corner, behind a towering bookcase, she noticed a faint draught, cool against her hand. Pressing gently, she felt the panel give, revealing a narrow door, its hinges silent and recently oiled. It opened into a cramped passage, its stone walls damp and unadorned, leading downward to a side door hidden by ivy at the manor's east wing. The door opened onto the garden, mere steps from the fountain where she'd found the receipt and button. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A house," she murmured, "is only as honest as its inhabitants." The passage was no relic of forgotten architecture. Its oiled hinges spoke of recent use. She stepped outside, noting the faint smell of tobacco clinging to the ivy, sharp like the gold-tipped cigarette from Crane's room. The ground near the door showed scuff marks, similar to those in the guest room, though these were fresher, pressed into the soft earth. Returning to the library, she found Eleanor Bantry, her face pale as she clutched a letter from the Morning Post. "Jane, you'll think me mad," Eleanor said, "but this house feels alive with secrets. I found this in the hall. A note from the butler saying a bottle of brandy is missing from the cellar. First the candlestick, then the tray, now this." Miss Marple patted her friend's arm. Small thefts often mask larger ones, my dear. Tell me, does this passage ring any bells? She described the hidden door, watching Eleanor's eyes widen. I had no idea, Eleanor gasped. Arthur mentioned the manor had old servant passages, but we never explored them. Do you think it's connected to Crane? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her mind racing. A hidden passage, a forced gate, a missing bottle. Each pointed to movement, to someone weaving through the manor unseen. She thought of a Chipping Norton widow who had once hidden stolen silver in her attic, thinking no one would look up. Secrets, she knew, thrived in overlooked places. She sought out Lawrence Redding next, finding him in the drawing room, sketching the view of the orchard. His charm was intact, but his eyes were shadowed, as if sleep had eluded him. Mr. Redding, she said, settling nearby with her knitting, this manor has such curious features. I found a passage behind the library bookcase leading to the garden. Have you ever used it, perhaps for a quiet stroll? Lawrence's pencil snapped, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He laughed too quickly. A passage? Sounds like something out of a novel. I've wandered the garden, sure, but I stick to the paths, never saw any hidden doors. His fingers fidgeted with the broken pencil, and Miss Marple noted a fresh stain on his cuff, green, not blue, and not on his sketch. Thank you, she said, her smile serene. His denial was too swift, his hands too restless. She recalled the blue paint from before, the green now, and wondered what else Lawrence might be painting or hiding. Later she found Dr. Haydock in the conservatory, examining a potted fern with undue attention. She mentioned Crane's disappearance, her voice gentle. It's troubling, isn't it, Doctor? Especially with that sedative you prescribed him. I noticed the bottle was missing from his room. Haydock's hand froze on the fern's leaves. Missing? He said, his voice tight. I left it on his nightstand. Standard dose for nervous exhaustion. If it's gone, someone must have taken it. His spectacles slipped, and he pushed them up, his movements jerky. Crane was a difficult patient, always talking about pressure, rivals. I told him to rest, but he wouldn't listen. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Pressure can make people reckless, she said, or desperate. Haydock's flush, his quick deflection, added another thread to her pattern. A missing sedative, a hidden passage, a forced gate. The pieces were aligning, but the picture remained blurred. That afternoon she returned to the garden, retracing her steps to the fountain. The scuff marks near the hidden door were clearer in daylight, joined by a faint imprint of a shoe, too large for Crane's polished brogues. She thought of the button's crest, the ledger's payments, and Clara's whispered fear. Someone had moved through this passage, perhaps with Crane, perhaps without. The tobacco scent lingered, a clue that tied the garden to the room. As dusk fell, she sat with Eleanor in the morning room, sharing her find. A passage, Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide. Jane, you're unravelling this place like a sweater. But who would use it, and why? Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. People, my dear, are like houses. They hide their doors until you know where to look. She thought of the Chipping Norton grocer, who had slipped through a back alley to avoid a creditor, only to be caught by a neighbour's sharp eyes. Crane's disappearance, she suspected, was no less deliberate, and the passage was its hinge. In her room that night she studied the ledger again, its entries to VC stark against the yellowed pages. The payments, the passage, the sedative, they pointed to a plan, one that required silence and stealth. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would gather the guests and test the threads she had woven. Someone in Ashfield Manor knew more than they admitted, and Miss Marple was ready to pull the knot loose. Chapter 7. The Truth at Dusk. The twilight hour settled over Ashfield Manor with a hush, the sky a deepening indigo that pressed against the tall windows of the drawing-room. Miss Jane Marple stood by the fireplace, her slight figure framed by the glow of the crackling logs, her knitting bag resting on a nearby chair. The guests were gathered at her request, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Eleanor Bantry sat stiffly, her hands clasped. Colonel Arthur Bantry fidgeted with his watch chain, muttering about dinner being delayed. Lawrence Redding leaned against the mantel, his charm dimmed by a wary glance. Clara Vane, her scarlet lips pursed, toyed with a bracelet, while Lydia Price's sharp eyes darted between her fellow guests. Dr. Simon Haydock sat apart, his spectacles reflecting the firelight, his fingers still. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was gentle but clear, cutting through the room's tension like a needle through cloth. Mr. Victor Crane's disappearance, she began, is no accident. It is a tapestry woven with intent, and each of you holds a thread. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, swept the room. Tonight, I propose to unravel it. She recounted the clues with precision. The torn receipt from the garden, bearing Crane's name, the gold-tipped cigarette in his untouched room, the etched button by the fountain, the ledger's payments to VC, the forced gate, the missing sedative, and the hidden passage behind the library bookcase. These are not random, she said. They tell a story of a man lured from his room, drugged and spirited away through the passage to the garden, where the locked window was meant to mislead us. Eleanor gasped softly, but the others remained silent, their faces taut. Miss Marple continued, her tone as calm as if discussing a village fete. Mr. Crane was a man under pressure. Business troubles, perhaps debts, as Dr. Haydock hinted, but he was also a man with secrets. Secrets someone in this room wished to keep hidden. Her gaze settled on Lawrence Redding. Mr. Redding, you saw Crane in the garden at dusk, agitated. You argued with him about a business venture, money, you said, for art sales. Yet your rag bore blue paint not on your canvas, and later green, suggesting you were elsewhere, perhaps near the passage. Lawrence's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She turned to Clara Vane. Miss Vane, you heard footsteps after midnight, yet your sherry-soaked tale seemed rehearsed, and your whispered talk of ruin with Mrs. Price suggests a shared fear. Clara's bracelet stilled, her eyes wide. Lydia Price shifted, her pearls clicking. Mrs. Price, Miss Marple said, your gossip about Crane's telephone call named Dr. Haydock, but your eagerness to share it felt like a diversion. Were you protecting someone, or yourself? Finally, she faced Dr. Haydock, whose hands were clenched. Doctor, you treated Crane for nervous exhaustion, knew his weaknesses. The missing sedative was yours, left in his room. And the ledger's payments to VC align with your time in London, where you met him. You spoke of his enemies, but perhaps you were one. Haydock's face crumpled, his spectacles slipping. It wasn't meant to go this far, he said, his voice breaking. Crane was blackmailing me about a mistake years ago, a patient I misdiagnosed. He demanded money, threatened to ruin me. I gave him the sedative, yes, to calm him, but I didn't expect, he faltered, his hands trembling. That night, I lured him to the garden through the passage. I only meant to talk, to make him stop, but he collapsed. Too much sedative, perhaps. I panicked, hid him in the village inn, thinking he'd leave when he woke. Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening but resolute. Fear, Doctor, is a poor master. It leads us to dark places. She turned to the others. Mr. Redding, your argument with Crane was a no-business venture. It was about his pressure on you, perhaps over forged paintings. Miss Vane and Mrs. Price, you knew of Crane's schemes, feared exposure. But it was Dr. Haydock who acted. Lawrence flushed. Clara's lips parted in a silent protest, and Lydia's face hardened, but none spoke. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. Good Lord, Jane, you've got a mind like a steel trap. But where's Crane now? Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. Constable Polk, I believe, can help us there. The inn is a likely place, given Dr. Haydock's confession. Polk, who had been lingering by the door, nodded eagerly. I'll check the village, Miss Marple. The Crown Inn's not far. He hurried out, his boots loud on the polished floor. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Eleanor looked at Miss Marple with awe. Jane, how do you see these things? She asked, her voice hushed. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. People, my dear, are like patterns. They seem complex, but if you watch closely, their stitches always show. She thought of Chipping Norton, where a baker's apprentice had once hidden stolen coins in a flour sack, betrayed by a smudge on his sleeve. Motives, she knew, were as old as human nature. Fear, greed, shame, and Crane's disappearance was no exception. As the guests dispersed, their faces a mix of relief and discomfort. Miss Marple remained by the fire, her needles clicking. The truth was out, but the manor's shadows seemed to linger as if reluctant to release their hold. She thought of the button's crest, still unidentified, and wondered if another thread remained unpulled. For now, though, the puzzle was solved, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a task well done. Chapter 8. The Guest's Return. The morning after Miss Marple's revelations in the drawing-room broke cold and clear, with a sharp wind rattling the windows of Ashfield Manor. The house, though still grand in its ivy-clad silhouette, seemed to exhale a breath it had held for days. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting in her lap, the soft click of her needles a steady counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. The clues she had woven together, the receipt, the cigarette butt, the button, the ledger, the hidden passage, had unravelled the mystery of Victor Crane's disappearance, yet she remained alert, her mind attuned to the possibility of loose threads. In her experience, even a solved puzzle could leave a stitch out of place. Constable Polk returned at mid-morning, his young face flushed with triumph. He had found Victor Crane at the Crown Inn, a modest establishment on the edge of Chipping Norton. He was there, Miss Marple, just as you thought, Polk said, standing in the hall with his helmet in hand. Dazed, a bit groggy, but alive. Said he didn't know how he got there. Last thing he remembers is walking in the garden at dusk. He's coming back to the manor now to collect his things. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling. Thank you, Constable. You've done well. A man found is a mystery half solved. Let us see what he has to say. Eleanor Bantry, hovering nearby, clasped her hands. Jane, it's a miracle. But what of Dr. Haydock and the others? This business has left us all on edge. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Truth, my dear, is a light that casts long shadows. We must face them all. Victor Crane arrived an hour later, his sharp jaw pale and his eyes shadowed with confusion. The guests gathered in the library at Eleanor's insistence, their faces a mix of relief and wariness. Lawrence Redding stood by the window, his sketchbook closed. Clara Vane sat with forced poise, her bangles still. Lydia Price's pearls gleamed as she watched Crane with narrowed eyes. Dr. Haydock, his spectacles low on his nose, stood apart, his expression one of quiet resignation. Colonel Bantry, for once, was silent, his moustache twitching as he leaned against a bookcase. Crane, seated in an armchair, spoke haltingly. "I don't know what happened," he said, his voice rough. "I was in the garden feeling unwell, nervous, you know. Then, nothing. I woke up at the inn, my head foggy. I swear I meant no trouble." His eyes flicked to Haydock, then away. Miss Marple, seated near the fire, studied him. His story aligned with Haydock's confession. The sedative, the passage, the panic. But there was a tremor in his voice, a hesitancy that suggested more. "Mr. Crane," she said, her tone soft but piercing, "you spoke of enemies, of business troubles. Were you running from someone, or to something?" Crane's hands clenched. "Business is a rough game," he muttered. "Debts, deals gone sour. I came here to lie low, but—" He trailed off, glancing at Haydock. "I won't press charges. I just want to leave." Miss Marple's needles paused. A wise choice, perhaps. But secrets, Mr. Crane, have a way of following us. She thought of the ledger's payments to VC, the button's unfamiliar crest. Crane's reticence hinted at a larger web, one she might never fully untangle. Yet the manor's mystery, at least, was resolved. Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his voice steady despite his pallor. "I'll face the consequences," he said. "I acted out of fear. Crane's threats would have ruined my practice, my life. I never meant harm, only to stop him." He turned to Eleanor and Arthur. "I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused." Eleanor's face softened, though her voice was firm. "You'll answer to the law, Doctor, but I'm glad no one was truly hurt." Arthur grunted, his earlier bluster replaced by grudging respect for Miss Marple's clarity. The other guests remained silent, their roles in the affair, Lawrence's argument, Clara and Lydia's whispered fears, left unaddressed but not unnoticed. Miss Marple knew better than to press. Some truths, like weeds, were best left to wither in silence. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple prepared to depart. Her suitcase was packed, her knitting tucked away. Eleanor walked her to the hall, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, clasping her hands. "How do you see these things? The passage, the sedative, Haydock's guilt. It's like you read the house itself." Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her lace cap. "People, Eleanor, are much like villages. They seem simple, but their secrets are always there, waiting for a quiet eye to notice. Ashfield Manor is no different. It spoke, and I listened." She boarded the omnibus back to Chipping Norton, the manor fading into the twilight behind her. As the countryside rolled by, she thought of a girl in her village who had once hidden a stolen locket in a haystack, caught only because a magpie had carried off a shiny clasp. Small things, she knew, revealed great truths. The button's crest nagged at her, a loose thread perhaps, but not one that threatened the pattern she had sewn. In her cosy drawing-room that evening, she resumed her knitting, the grey shawl growing under her fingers. The world, she mused, was full of mysteries, each waiting for a patient hand to unravel it. And Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and sharper mind, was ready for the next.